us about the Bayfront 2020 plan. Imagine that we just drove down from Macon, Georgia. We just moved to Sarasota. We have no idea what's going on with that Bayfront. Tell us about the plan.
And as a new resident, you'd say to yourself, why are they using this beautiful Bayfront for cars?
For a parking lot,
For
exactly.
a parking lot.
Yeah.
And we asked that same question, and 4 years ago decided to get the community involved in a conversation about what the city's 42 acres could be on the Bayfront. And started out with a small little group of the Arts Alliance, Ringling College, Visit Sarasota Chamber, kept talking, kept dreaming. Michael Klauber was a visionary volunteer leader of our efforts. And it eventually got to the point that we brought in some professional help and started really looking at a process where the community could devise the guiding principles and ensure that the things we want in the Bayfront would be there. And no matter how the political sands would shift and turn over the years, we'd have our guiding principles to guide the redevelopment. So we established those principles. We now have 56 different community organizations working with us. And now we have formed a nonprofit organization called the Sarasota Bayfront Planning Organization, chaired by A.G. Lafley, the former CEO of Procter & Gamble. And they're actually going to be hiring master planning firms to actually do the groundwork master plan for the Bayfront.
So he went from being in charge of Procter & Gamble, a worldwide company, to this effort.
What's interesting is when he was in Cincinnati with Procter & Gamble, he led the community effort that did the redevelopment of the Pioneer Park in the heart of downtown. And some of their waterfront areas.
So that makes him qualified for this. He'll probably find this more difficult than running P&G, but...
He will find it more difficult if only, the very first concern is you have a lot of existing leaseholders on the property who you need to make sure are kept whole in some way.
So the 42 acres are the Van Wezel parking lot area, the Gee Whiz area on the other side of the creek, the Symphony facility behind the municipal auditorium. Is the municipal auditorium part of it as well?
Yes, so it is that whole frontage along 41 to the Bayfront, from Boulevard of the Arts to the boat ramps at 10th Street.
Okay, all right, so that whole area. Do you anticipate that all the buildings will be replaced? I know the city wants to invest quite a bit in the municipal auditorium, for example, to renovate that. So is that a building that will be retained?
I think that is the key to the conversation over the next 2 years. And I think it will take an 18-month planning window, because you can't it's not a clean slate. So it's about a lot of conversations with the people who are there, with the community, and coming up with solutions. I doubt we will all be happy at the end, but the idea is to really activate that community vision.
Now we have a building, Gee Whiz, which was designed by Skidmore, Owings and Merrill and renovated by you, Dale Parks, in about 20 years ago, right? Yeah, and that's on the property. And then we have Van Wezel Hall is on the property. A much beloved building, but a building that's become kind of controversial. So let's talk about Gee Whiz and the renovation that you did, and do you think it can be fit into this 2020 plan?
I think that the building can...
Hold the mic right up close.
I think that the building itself can be repurposed, and I think that it could be worked around and it could stay in the plan itself. I'm hoping that it stays in the plan. I think that Sarasota has a history of tearing down a lot of its architectural history and building new stuff. One of the things that marks any community is that the architecture, especially the Selby Library, the old Selby Library that was designed by Skidmore, Owings and Merrill and Van Wezel, both are iconic structures in Sarasota, and they should be retained because it marks our time. If we continue down the path of tearing things down and building new stuff, then where do we stop?
exactly.
So,
You know, interestingly enough, in a rival publication to the Herald-Tribune recently, a person who had actually worked in Van Wezel Hall gave deep consideration to the question of should Van Wezel Hall be saved, and she said, although I love the building, I'm afraid that it's become functionally obsolete. You've done some work, Jonathan, on Van Wezel Hall. How do you see its future?
Well, I do have a unique perspective on the whole project. The first time I actually saw this park was in 1971. My family flew into the old Sarasota airport. We were driving down to Boca Grande on 41, and we do that for years and years. And the first moment as a kid that you could actually see the water, that kind of public vista up going south on 41 was to the right. So I always got that. I got that seat in the car first. Made my sister sit on the other side.
Yeah.
And then when I moved here full time in 1997, actually Dale and I lived in the same building, the Francis Carlton. And if you wanted to go see the sunset from downtown, you'd scamper, drive over to the Bayfront. So in visiting here and then in living here, you know, I sort of had a strong connection to that. We just finished a little bit ago a kind of significant upgrade to a lot of the interiors of the Van Wezel, specific to the public spaces and the women's bathrooms. And you know, you went in there before and it looked a little bit like the women's bathrooms and men's bathrooms in particular, sort of like a 1930s kind of prison, dangling light bulbs and, you know, things that didn't work. And you know, it was interesting to actually have the process of working through that and looking at what sort of the short-term, long-term goals were. You know, we're currently also now been engaged by the city to help bring back the municipal auditorium. So now I have two projects, actually, let's call it, on that site. And one of the things I also think, because there's such an intimacy to that land with me, is years ago, the Alinari and the Renaissance, when they were going up, which look over that park, I'm pretty sure they signed documents with the city, and those documents said that if the city's going to redevelop anything, there was a height restriction. And sometimes people forget about that, and ultimately, I don't think the Alinari and Renaissance are going to let anybody forget about that, right? Okay.
Right. Virginia, does that complicate the issue, having this height restriction?
One of the things that the city helped us with was producing a technical report on all of those exact conditions. So it's not only a height restriction, but there's building massing requirements too, a limitation on building massing. There's state submerged lands. There were state grants that were used to build the boat ramps, and we have a significant marine industry that absolutely depends on having those boat ramps, not just recreational, but Monday through Friday.
Fishing guides and things like that.
Well,
Yeah.
boat manufacturers,
Okay.
even bigger than fishing guides. So there's a lot of very complicated uses within that site that we're going to have to really be aware of. And I think, you know, when you talk about that vista and the access to the bayfront, that's become even more critical as we're about to move thousands of people into the Rosemary district. That's their access to the water.
Yeah.
Harold, there's one, if you look at aerial photos from not all that long ago, where the boat ramp currently used to be actually a power plant. And,
exactly right.
And
Florida
also
Power
one of the
Line.
reasons why the boat ramp and manufacturers are very concerned is because as a body of water, Sarasota Bay is one of the few that do not have a speed restriction or a noise restriction. So that's one of the reasons why we can have the offshore races here.
another thing to keep in mind is also the FEMA has revised their flood maps. And before, like when I worked on GWIZ, and I know when the Van Wezel also was being renovated, that they were in what's considered the worst flood zone that you could possibly be in, and you had to renovate to 50%. That has now changed so that you can build on the ground, on the grade, and it helps the master plan in the sense that you don't have to elevate the buildings anymore. It used to be that anything new that was going to go into that site had to be elevated at least to 19 feet So you are looking at a building basically, not unlike this Herald-Tribune where you have parking underneath it. They were not considered habitable spaces. So the fact that the FEMA maps were revised and this site in particular was changed so that you could build right on grade has tremendously helped the potential for this master plan.
So you can build on grade in this 42 acres? Is that what you're saying?
Yes, you can.
Okay, wow. And of course, the Van Wezel is elevated already on a mound, so does that
When the
ensure its survival? Help?
When the Van Wezel was being renovated was very close to the time that we renovated into the G-Wiz building. And we had to deal with the 50% rule.
Okay.
The elevations may be slight, but they're not in V zones. The V zone is considered the worst that you
And the Van Wezel is in a V zone or an A zone?
It used to be in a V zone. Now it's
Okay.
in an A zone.
Now it's in an A.
G-Wiz,
so, yeah.
G-Wiz as well is in an A
Right,
zone. now.
yeah, okay. What would you like to see there? I mean, would you like to see just one performing arts hall? I know there's always a scheduling problem with the Van Wezel, overbooking and that kind of thing. Would just building a new performing arts hall and replacing the Van Wezel fix that problem?
I think my vision is broader than that. What I hope is that the Bayfront will be transformed to that iconic place that when you have friends and family visiting, that's the first place you take them. That is the place to go. It's activated. You feel comfortable. There's always things going on. What that will be is not up to me. It's up to the people who are here. And that's what this process is about. We just really wanted to make sure that this was a process that involved the entire community, not just a small group of people who turn out to meetings.
Okay, right. Talk about the center aisle situation at Van Wezel Hall. Could one be added, and why doesn't it have one now?
I actually have a copy of the original Taliesin proposal that shows all the plans, all the sections, and even the parking layout that the Frank Lloyd Wright folks anticipated. And in looking at those drawings, it looks like the only thing you could potentially do to add, so you can't add a center aisle, because if you're going up, there's no there, number one. But imagine a stadium, and imagine a stadium where you're at the top, but you have to come down and go through like a portal to underneath. That they could actually do that, which would be kind of weird. It'd be the only one that I'd ever seen. But if people always complain about that center aisle, fundamentally those are the best seats, right now also. And it's one of the few halls that really is almost like acoustically perfect. Gets close to it. There's not a bad seat in the Van Wezel, except if you're sitting in the middle, I guess, and you have to go to the bathroom. Then becomes a great seat becomes a bad seat. So in the traditional sense of adding a center aisle that we kind of have seen in other, it's really not set up for that. The lobbies are on the sides. They're not, and then obviously you can't go towards the stage. And then if you're going up. So it would be a very unusual layout, but and it would be very expensive. The floors there are really thick. I mean, they're like a foot of concrete. It's not a normal construction. Concrete was probably, seemingly, when we did our renovation work and we were doing exploratory, it seemed like concrete was maybe like free at that time, because the walls are incredibly thick, the floors are incredibly thick, the ceilings are incredibly thick with concrete. So it is actually built very well, unlike when we were talking about earlier, the bones of Sarasota High School. So Van Wezel is actually built like a tank.
Built by Taliesin Associated Architects William Wesley Peters,
Yeah.
who was quite a good architect and also had the wisdom to marry Frank Lloyd Wright's daughter. Doesn't hurt the career at all. Look at the size of the crowd here, Virginia. This is the biggest audience of our program today. And I would like to just take a poll. Who would like to see the Van Wezel kept? Raise your hand. Who would like to see the Van Wezel replaced? Raise your hand. I would say that's probably about a 70-30 split. So go ahead and weigh in on that. You know, the
and-
polls, sometimes fake news, but go ahead.
But I think this is where the community involvement becomes key, because we asked that same question when we did a listening session to reach a different segment of the community. We were in J-Dubs, the brewery. Everyone got a free beer. And it skewed to a different audience. And that audience was not particularly concerned about the future of the physical building of Van Wezel.
So
That's why
it's demographic then, is what you're saying.
Well, I think demographic, and I think that's why you need to go out of your way in the ways that you have the conversation with the community. And that's one reason why this is also being funded privately. This is not using government money. Drayton Saunders is doing the fundraising. The Patterson Foundation helped us with the initial grant to get it off the ground. But again, we want the ability to go into the community and really involve people in non-traditional ways in this effort. Obviously, at some point you turn it over to the professionals, because I'd hate to think of what the Bayfront would look like if we all tried to design it.
You know, it should be noted that you've read in the newspapers and the magazines about Sarasota being the best this, the best place to do this, the best place to do that, the best beaches, the happiest people, etc. That's all because of Virginia Haley at Visit Sarasota. She brings them all down, and then for your convenience, she has sent them home in the last week. So you are able to get here to the Herald-Tribune easily today.
One of the reasons why this is important to put a vision in place is because these plans need to kind of, let's call it, live on. We need to think about that it's expensive, it needs to be funded, and eventually gets passed on to the next generations. If we put things on paper that the next generation, let's call it the millennials, don't subscribe to, then all of that effort is lost. So it's really important that it is a community effort, because what did Daniel Burnham say, Dale? Make no small plans, I think, when planning Chicago. And eventually the reimagining of the mall in D.C. on the Potomac. People forget about that. You know, they moved the Potomac over for the Jefferson Memorial, so make no small plans, right?
That's when they built the swamp.
Right. But Dale, my question to you is, because I always feel like you speak very well in architectural terms, is if you were to be charged with changing the seating in there, kind of what are your thoughts?
In the Van Wezel?
Inside the Van Wezel, yeah. You kind of got past
This
that.
is the first time a panelist has become the moderator, so go ahead and answer that excellent question.
I have a tendency to agree with Jonathan on that. Van Wezel doing a center island is a hard thing to do. And the Van Wezel values their seats as well, obviously, for the revenue that it generates. So it would be very difficult to retrofit Van Wezel with the center aisle.
I think what maybe we could do is charge a premium for the seats that are in the center aisle area and use that money to fund the 2020 effort. You know, like instead of $90 to see the symphony, it'd be $180. Everybody would pay that, right? To be right in the middle?
You just mentioned the symphony. I mean, the hall itself, you know, being that, you know, a famous acoustician actually did the layout for the hall. You know, it might not be good for, let's call it, traveling Broadway shows, but in terms of a hall that's kind of close to acoustically perfect, it actually is a good hall for live music.
Okay. When the building was built, I was but 16 years old or so in Sarasota. I went to one of the first performances there, and I had always heard that the acoustics at the Van Wezel were amazing, and all the big artists wanted to come here, even though Sarasota was a fairly small town, because they wanted to perform in that hall. So, show of hands, who likes the acoustics at Van Wezel? Okay, so that's, I don't know, maybe somebody hard of hearing called me on the phone one day and said, the acoustics there are terrible. So, I'm sorry? Who does not like the acoustics at Van Wezel Hall? The symphony hates it. Okay, but the symphony guys are on the stage, they're not in the seats. These people are in the seats, and they like it. So let's talk about the acoustics. Jonathan or Virginia or somebody?
Well, if I could mention one thing very quickly, I think one of the things that's very clear is that our cultural organizations have all just achieved amazing work in the last couple of years and are getting better and better. I mean, you look at the ballet, the orchestra, what we are able to bring to the Van Wezel, but there are a lot of other arts groups, and we are under this tremendous scheduling pressure. And that's when the symphony is performing with a guest artist and cannot rehearse on the stage where they're performing, that's a real hindrance to excellence.
Right. Well, in my opinion, I will throw this out now because I've written this. If you don't have a hall that has a new hall that has multiple venues, like the Sydney Opera House has 5 venues in it, and that's really expensive. How are you going to fix that problem by replacing? I would like to think that maybe we should save the Van Wezel and build another hall. Is that feasible? Thank you very much. I appreciate that. What do you guys think?
Well, your earlier question was about the acoustics, so I want to address that first. There's 2 halls of this size in really kind of, let's call it, east of the Mississippi that really stand out in terms of sight lines, and one is actually here in Sarasota, the Van Wezel, and the other is Kleinhand's Music Hall in Buffalo, designed by Saarinen. And both are really highly regarded, typically from a, let's call it, audience standpoint. To answer your, Dale, I don't know if you talked about the acoustics at all. Okay. And then, Harold, your question about keeping the hall?
Yes.
Well, once again, you have to think about, like I said, what the community wants. There's a lot of embedded energy into the Van Wezel. There's a lot of memories. People have had their graduations there. People have gone to events there in anniversaries, and so it does have that legacy things that really make a place a place. Years ago, when I was talking to Carl Abbott, he was talking about Sarasota being one of those places that is very different than other places in the United States. Like if you go to certain towns, and when we were talking about it, there still was not a Starbucks in downtown Sarasota, but he was saying about how if you go to places and you kind of put a blindfold on when you're delivered, spin around, and then you take the blindfold off, and you kind of count the Home Depots and the Lowe's and the Starbucks, and then they pluck you up and take you a couple states away and do the same thing. You're thinking you're in the same town. And Sarasota has been one of those places that sort of is a little bit kind of like Brigadoon, where it's kind of fallen into the mist a little bit and kind of comes back up once in a while. And I think that nature of Sarasota, my wife and I recently went up to St. Pete for an evening, and it didn't have that special feel, that special flavor. It felt like a city, but Sarasota felt like comes back and it's like a special place. So if you start taking away those special places, you better understand what you're doing. And if you're doing it, then hopefully you're going to place it with something that can be as significant of that heartbeat for the community.
If you look at a photo of Sarasota, having Van Wezel Hall in the picture does add recognition. St. Petersburg, on the other hand, just tore down its single most iconic building, the pier, the inverse pyramid pier by Harvard Jolly, who was invited to be here today but did not attend. So they took away their landmark. They do have the Don Cesar, which the Vinoy, that helps.
The Dolly is their new icon.
Yes, but it takes years for it to build up in the mind's eye.
But you can't see the Dolly from almost anywhere in town, right?
Yeah.
And so good friends of ours who've been coming down for 20 years kind of looked out there and didn't realize that it was gone. And basically, I think they said it kind of looks like a doctor's tongue depressor sticking out into the water with like nothing there.
Yeah.
And so they were very kind of shocked to see something that they had seen from their youth into their adulthood, married. Now, he's a Fulbright scholar, teaches at Yale, shows up and says, where's the inverted pyramid? You could see on his face that it was, something was, let's call it, missing.
Dale Parks.
The importance, and Jonathan has touched on it a little bit, is that Sarasota does have iconic buildings in it. And if we tear them down, then we're not unlike any other city around Sarasota. And one of the biggest examples is you're sitting under it right now. The Herald-Tribune has moved out of this building. This building was designed specifically for the Herald-Tribune. Now that nobody's in it, it's outlived its purpose, people would say. If you're going to tear down the building this big, you know, the land itself is worth quite a bit of money. But retrofitting this building to accommodate rentals for offices and things like that is possible. And you wouldn't imagine Sarasota tearing down this building. It's just too big. It's too nice.
I have no comment on that. Virginia, bring us home. Where do we go from here in the Bayfront 2020 planning process? What's the timeline?
I think at this point they hope to issue the RFQ, the request for qualifications for planners, probably in the early fall, and get underway.
Will this be a worldwide search?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. And I think one of the things that will be important is for people to stay engaged. Everyone has been so great about being engaged over these last 3 years, but this is the critical time. This is when people really need to watch the process, be conversant in it. They are working on some new methods to help in the conversation online, in addition to meetings, so please stay tuned for all of that.
So we've got a big crowd here of interested, engaged people. We're going to have 10 minutes between this panel and the next one.
Traffic there's been no concern about providing for traffic. Building buildings up to the property line or near it. If the quay gets built, in my opinion, that will be the death knell for downtown Sarasota. Would you address that?
US 41 in front of the Ritz-Carlton now is not very passable in the winter and could get worse. So let's talk about traffic. Very important part of the planning process. Who wants to take it?
Well, if you drive a car into the city of London, you actually have to pay. And there actually are cars and certain lorries and vehicles that are not allowed to come in during certain times. So there is precedent that works at a very, very high level in cities that are much more denser than Sarasota to basically put kind of checks and balances in place. But things are changing. I have a friend and longtime friend, and his son just turned 18, and he absolutely does not want to have a driver's license. He is of a different generation. He doesn't have that car-centric mentality. You know, we as a firm did the Palm Avenue garage, one with the sales, and there was a lot of discussion about electric charging during that time, and now we're doing a new project out at St. Armand's, and the conversation, though very similar, same client, City of Sarasota, very different conversation about parking and about traffic. There's a gentleman in the City of Sarasota, his name is Mark Lyons, incredibly knowledgeable. If you guys don't know who he is, you definitely should, if you're interested in these things. He's a very smart guy, and I would say that we're probably now, in terms of the 20 years of not having planning, he's kind of a recent hire. So I think the city is fundamentally reimagining how they think about these things. We have, he brings in, where are we going to deal with Lyft, and how are we going to deal with Uber, and how are we dealing with potentially self-driving cars, and what happens in the future if this parking garage has to be converted because cars don't park anymore. They're always moving around because they're automated. So things are changing, and when you talk to these people, you realize that they're actually pretty smart about things, and we're in good hands. So I would say that other people have maybe different takes on it. Dale, I'd love to hear your thoughts about it.
We are sadly out of time. So perhaps you guys could get together in the lunchroom and he will share his thoughts. But we have run out of time. Thank you so much to our fabulous panelists, the amazing Virginia Haley, the very talented Dale Parks, and the superbly talented Jonathan Parks. And they're not brothers, by the way.